They are, in fact, committing suicide. Canada, in economic terms, and I think in cultural terms as well, Canada doesn't have to do this. It's very clear. You have massive natural resources. You have a relatively small population, not speaking down to Canada, but it's roughly a tenth of what we have here in the US. A massive, massive land base. You should be exploiting your natural resources to get your economy back up and going. And instead, your economy is languishing. I'm not, pointing out anything you don't know, but it's been terrible under these progressive policies, and you're lagging. And I don't know what it's going to take to make, Canadians to wake up, to understand how destructive these policies have been.
You have come to the right place. I love this. Money back guaranteed interview. Robert Bryce. You can find him on Substack. You know him from Power Hungry, all sorts of things, but really in demand around the English-speaking world, putting perspective, putting expertise to bear on the whole energy/climate change/political issues there. Could we get him at a better time? I don't think so. Robert, thanks for finding time. I know you've been traveling very, very heavily recently, so we appreciate it.
Always happy to be with you, Michael.
Interesting here in Canada, and I'm going to throw that out here right at the beginning, because we have Mark Carney as the presumptive Liberal leader. He'll be Prime Minister by the time, by this time next week. When you, of course, in our system, he'll be the head of the Liberals. They're still in power, technically, but they're still in power, so he's Prime Minister. Well, one of the things that you've just been dealing with is the impact of the net zero policy that Mark Carney is literally the co-founder of, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero and the Bank Net Zero Alliance. This is the guy. So tell us what you were telling the people in the UK, because it looks like, they got the highest power prices in Europe, in the continent.
They do. And Britain is a mess. I mean, just truly a mess. And I see the very similar kind of policy decisions in Canada, in the UK, and in Australia, and remarkably so, that these three countries have adopted this ruinous economic energy/climate policy that is going to just devastate their respective economies, and no understanding of what is really happening around the rest of the world. And this is key. Britain, in fact, it was just 2 weeks ago now that there was an announcement of a new discovery of natural gas near Lincolnshire. 16 trillion cubic feet, Mike, 16 trillion cubic feet onshore. All they have to do is drill and frack for it, and they won't do it. And instead, the Labour government in the UK, once they were asked for a statement, they said, "Oh well, we intend to ban hydraulic fracturing for good, and we're going to go to this clean energy economy." I mean, the amount of delusion that is happening in the UK, in Canada, and in Australia around energy and climate is really, really stunning. And I had a chance to see it firsthand in London.
One of the things that, I'm big on, go ahead, choose what you want, but know the consequences. And one of the consequences that people will react to, but it will be too late, as they have in Germany, as they have in the UK right now, is those high power prices. I mean, people look at their power bill and it's unworkable for a huge percentage of the population now.
It is. And, here's what as my late brother, John Bryce, said, just grills my cheese. That just infuriates me, is that you have the nominally the left, right? The progressives. I mean, you call them liberals. I mean, in Australia, they get them all backwards. But so the progressives, the people who in theory would be in favor of the working class and the working poor. And instead, all of these climate policies, every one of these decarbonization and climate policies screws the poor and the working class. Working class folks don't buy Teslas. They don't buy electric vehicles. They're buying, pickup trucks. The tradesmen are driving, carpenters, bricklayers. And let me give you just one example. When I was in London, we were there for 10 days. We went around and walked around a lot. And I'm a reporter, so I'm always talking to people. And I would ask shopkeepers and people in retail and about their power bills. This one was the one. So the cabbie gave me an earful, right? And said that his power bills have tripled in the last 4 years. The bartender, though, at the pub around the corner from the hotel, a woman who was in her 20s, I said, "Tell me about what's going on with your energy bill." And she said, "Well, I live with my parents and we don't shower at home anymore." And I said, "What are you talking about?" And she said, "It costs us too much to heat the water at our house or our flat. And so we go to the gym." Can you
Wow.
imagine? I
Yeah.
mean, can you imagine? Their energy bills have doubled on average. That was what I heard over and over. Power bills for and energy bills for average working class British people have doubled in the last 4 years, and they're being crushed by it. And yet, Keir Starmer and the Labour Party, they're full speed ahead on this net zero nonsense.
And I guess my thing is, I wonder how many people who voted for the Labour Party understood that this is the relationship. This is what, in fact, they voted for. I mean, because I'm seeing that in Canada. And again, it's a democracy. You have a right to vote who you want, but you should know what the implications are, because the other side we're looking at all the time, and as I say, I know you were just there, is companies don't sit around for that. Energy is a huge component of the cost of doing business. And I'm watching, companies from the UK move. And
Sure.
I suspect Canada's, Trump is giving reason if he goes through with the tariffs this coming week. But, companies will avoid those tariffs by moving. But when you start adding things on, like the energy cost becoming uncompetitive, I mean, the implications obviously ripple through the entire society.
Well, and again, who does this hurt? It hurts the poor and the middle class.
Yeah.
And what are my politics? I'm consider myself, look, I'm not a Republican, I'm not a Democrat. I'm disgusted. I'm totally disgusted. I don't want to be part of any party that would have me. But I think the key divide now in the United States and Canada, around the world, it's not the left versus the right, it's the rich versus the poor.
Yeah.
And these decarbonization policies all of them are regressive. All of them are regressive. And I mentioned the issue with the bartender, but the cabbies, the retail workers, who pays the heaviest price? It's those folks. And that's the part where it is unfortunate. I'll just say this about Trump, that it's potentially estranging the Canadians. I don't get it. I think Trump is a lunatic, but there are parts of the things he's doing that I could kiss him for, especially on the solar and wind issues, right? Because of the land use issues. I think some of that is just fantastic, and is a desire to provide more cheap, abundant, reliable energy. But it's unfortunate, and I think you're right, that Trump's threats of tariffs against Canada has hurt Polyev and helped Carney. And you need to get rid of the Trudeauism and the Trudeau crowd, because this again is, I think it's fracturing Canada, estranging Alberta from the rest of the country even further. But it's just terrible policy. And fortunately, look at the election of the new coalition government in Germany. They're seeing the lights. What Friedrich Merz just said, we think we're going to stop dismantling our nuclear reactors. You can see a restart of nuclear power in Germany. That's a big turnaround.
Yeah. Well, and again, the challenge is huge because Trump elicits an emotional response.
Yeah.
That's not the way you should be making policy. I don't believe that's the way you should be voting either. I mean, do we not have, you're allowed to have whatever core issues you care about or priority issues, but, and it is an emotional response primarily in Canada at this right now.
Sure.
I love the one that in your area where they'd go, we're going to show them, we're going to stop all our oil and gas exports. Like, yeah. Have you ever done a calculation what that would cost Canada?
Sure.
And
Canada is interesting, in many ways. In Alberta, just an example, Danielle Smith, it was last February, a year ago now, that the provincial government there instituted new regulations on wind and solar. The most restrictive wind and solar ordinances I've seen anywhere around the world, and I've been tracking it for a long time. 35-kilometer setback for wind projects and solar projects from the Rocky Mountain parks, and also the preservation of ag land. So, there are a number of aspects to this, Michael. It's partly, yes, it's the issue of cost and reliability on energy and power, but the other, of course, is land use. And I've been maintaining the renewable rejection database now since 2015. I've recently launched the global renewable rejection database so that I can capture other countries where these local communities, provincial governments are saying, we don't want this stuff. So, these wind and solar projects, we don't want our ag land taken up by these alternative energy projects. So there are multiple facets to and downsides to all of this alt energy insanity. And one of them, of course, is the impacts it has on rural residents all over the world.
I love, by the way, you are the original database for this, where you look at different communities right down to the community level. Yeah. What did they vote for? They voted against adding on solar. They may have, it may be something else too, but even that solar database I found absolutely fascinating, because it all I want is an honest conversation.
Sure.
And the conversation is, you are not going to be able to run the grid on solar and wind if they are rejecting those every time you put a project up. And there's been a huge backlash, though, that you've been chronicling on your database there. I just congratulate you for that. I think it's incredibly important information when you start drilling down to, let's talk practicality here.
Well, thank you. I work hard at it, and I quote W. Edwards Deming, the industrial analyst, who said, "In God we trust, all others bring data." Well, here's the data, right? I'm and not my numbers, the numbers. These are the realities of what's happening. So, speaking of the UK, just since January 1st, there have been 6 solar projects in the UK that have been rejected. There were 4 in January alone. Yeah. So all around the United Kingdom, people are saying we don't want these solar projects in particular, but they're also fighting back against what they call the pylons, transmission towers, high voltage transmission. This is another hot button issue. It's a hot button issue in Australia. I think I'm planning to I'm on a speaking tour in Australia in June because of the backlash across rural Australia against solar, wind, high voltage transmission. All of these technologies, they require vast amounts of land. And I'm a lifelong bird watcher, Mike. I want to be outside. I love being outside. I love the birds. I love bats. And there's just this anti-environmentalism that is being pushed by these climate NGOs because they see the climate issue as the only issue. And I just, it just makes me spitting mad because, climate change is a concern. It's not our only concern.
Well, what you've described in the UK, though, is sort of leads in one of my questions is, are you seeing a change in attitude? Well, clearly not in the part of the government. I would have thought there's something like back to Germany, canceling their nuclear power plants with no backup plan whatsoever, not understanding that if you went to wind and solar, you needed backup. The list is a long one of what the mistakes they've made. So maybe there's a shift in sentiment in Germany, but I'm not hearing that from what you say in the UK. And I'm wondering about Canada. I mean, we'll have a vote soon. Yeah. And essentially, it's the same vote we've had the last 3 times when it comes to, what's your priority? Is it, climate change? But with a proviso here, keep in mind, we're 1.5% of total global emissions.
Sure.
So we should be talking about it within that context, in Canada. But I'm just wondering what your sense is. Has there been enough blowback? Is there enough people saying, well, look, can we get practical and this isn't?
Well, let me just return to the UK for just a second. So we had a very instructive, we were staying in Trafalgar Square and we took a taxi to the British Museum on Sunday. And you want to know what's happening in a place, ask the cabbie, right?
Yeah.
What do they think, right? And what he said about British politics today, he says, we have a uniparty. The Labour and Tories are essentially the same. And it's a key insight because remember, when Liz Truss, who was a Tory, became prime minister, and she was only in office for 6 or 7 weeks, she immediately said, we're going to repeal the ban on hydraulic fracturing. Remember, Britain is one of, I think, 7 or 8 countries in Europe that have a ban on hydraulic fracturing. And that push, by the way, was in part funded by Vladimir Putin and the Russians, right, to institute these fracking bans across Europe for obvious reasons, right? They wanted to make Europe dependent on Russian gas. They were very effective, and now we've got Ukraine and a whole mess that comes with it. But he said it's a uniparty, and that was right. So the Labour was anti-fracking. Truss comes in as a Tory and says, no, we're going to repeal the ban. She's thrown out. Rishi Sunak is a different Tory. He gets in, saying we're going to reinstate the fracking ban. And now you've got Keir Starmer, who is saying, we're going to make the ban on fracking permanent. They have massive shale resources onshore in Britain. They could be tapping those now. They could be drilling and fracking. And instead, they're not. And what's happening? Their gas production is declining. They're more and more dependent on imports, and their prices are skyrocketing. It's as Paul Marshall said at the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship conference last week, he said, this is national economic suicide. And I think that's exactly right.
Back to the net zero.
Yeah.
One of the things I have not seen discussed thoroughly is what cost would that be? Doesn't it all sound great? And at some point, you got to get practical. So how much is it? And I know I was going to call him Prime Minister Carney, not yet, but Mark Carney's, backgrounder, his own stuff, an outrageous amount of money is going to be spent. I don't think people appreciate it. They sort of say, net zero sounds great. Well, what do you want in taxes? What do you want in debt? What do you want, And I just don't see a practical discussion over the cost of trying to achieve that.
There is no practical discussion of any of it. And or the jobs that it would affect. And Starmer keeps talking about, clean energy jobs. Come on. There's all this alt energy crap. Just it destroys jobs. But look at what happened in the UK last September. The steelworks in Port Talbot in Wales, the last blast furnace in Britain, was shuttered by Tata Steel. So here's the cradle of the Industrial Revolution.
Yes.
And now they can't make virgin steel. I mean, this is bonkers. This is total. Yeah. This is, as the Brits would say, barking mad, loony round the bend. And then what happened in January? The Ineos, the chemical company in Britain, closed their last synthetic ethanol plant in that region. And why? Because of high energy prices. The auto sector is next. I mean, they are, in fact, committing suicide. Canada, in economic terms, and I think in cultural terms as well, Canada doesn't have to do this. It's very clear. You have massive natural resources. You have a relatively small population, not speaking down to Canada, but it's roughly a tenth of what we have here in the U.S. A massive, massive land base. You should be exploiting your natural resources to get your economy back up and going. And instead, your economy is languishing. I'm not, pointing out anything you don't know, but it's been terrible under these progressive policies, and you're lagging. And I don't know what it's going to take to make, Canadians to wake up, to understand how destructive these policies have been.
It's interesting. I saw a comment this past week that I thought was right on, is that the trouble is a certain percentage, as you just alluded to a couple minutes ago, isn't being impacted by bad policy. And I'll use an extreme. There's no policy the government could put in would impact Bill Gates' life, pardon the cliche. Yeah. But the point is there. And yet we're watching from the ground up. We used to say, oh, that bottom 20%'s in trouble. Oh, that bottom 40. In Canada, I'm looking at numerous polls. I'd put it at about 55% and growing, because we also have a declining Canadian dollar that's impacting even higher up. So, I don't think they wake up until the decision makers are impacted. Keep in mind, it doesn't matter even COVID. They didn't miss a pay raise. Literal. Yeah. They didn't miss a pay raise. Their pensions aren't in jeopardy. They have expense accounts that aren't audited, I might add. They have drivers. The list is on. So I don't know if you get there until that class is impacted more severely.
Well, I hope you're wrong, because they are insulated and from a lot of this foolishness. And I'll make one other quick point, and I've written about this as well. These oligarchs, and we'll call them what they are, many of them, they're oligarchs. They live on, they have yachts. Yep. Jeff Bezos' yacht has a yacht. It's like, but Bezos is also funding a lot of these climate action groups. The same with Michael Bloomberg, the same with Mark Zuckerberg, Laurene Powell Jobs, John Doerr. The list goes on, right? They're not just the rich, they're the super, super rich. Yeah. And so they are the ones who are funding a lot of these in these climate NGOs. And why are they doing it? Well, I think there's some, carbon indulgences at work here, right? But that Zuckerberg is funding climate journalists at NPR. I haven't seen NPR doing much on the CO2 emissions at Facebook, right? So it's like there's a protection scheme at work here as well. And I say that as a reporter. I've watched this. I've never had a real job. I've been a reporter my whole career. But this is the game now, that these massive amounts of money from these super, super elites are driving a lot of this climate agenda. And it's a point that I made in my speech in London last week. I travel a lot. I do a lot of public speaking, and I'm inevitably asked, what motivates these groups? Are they really anti-human? And I said, well, you have to remember, this is a business. It's a massive business, these climate groups. They raise a lot of money, and they employ a lot of people, and they want to keep their jobs.
I'll throw one more at you, because we know just got our first sort of quarterly report on this, but we know the billionaires are lining up behind Mark Carney, out of what you just said.
Oh, is that right? Interesting.
No, it's like it's in the data right there, sitting there. So, I mean, the challenge is huge. We know who's impacted. That's why, as I say, Robert, I would really invite people to go to Robert Bryce's, BRYCE, Robert Bryce at Substack. Just original work, original reporting. The data is there always, and you can find them also at Power Hungry on Twitter.
Yeah, at PWR Hungry, and then on Substack, robertbryce.substack.com.
Yeah.
And then I also have 2 documentaries, juicethemovie.com and juicetheseries.com. It's 13 months ago we released our 5-part docuseries, which is available on YouTube. It's been viewed over 3 million times now.
Yeah.
So,
I appreciate you mentioning that. I'm sorry it slipped my mind. Absolutely. I've watched it. It's terrific. And, available right there on. And I just think the more people are informed, then they can make an informed decision. You can have what priorities you want. But I really get concerned about informed decision making because I worry about it. I'll leave it at that. But Robert, thank you for all the work you do. And by the way, I know this was a busy time. Please know how much I appreciate you finding time for us.
Oh, look, always a pleasure, Mike. There's, this is my purpose and my passion. I'm incredibly lucky to do what I do. And so I'm flattered to be invited and have me back.
Guaranteed. There's awesome. A guarantee I can throw out there. Thanks, Robert.
All right. Thank you, my friend.